Hello, sociology. Welcome to the understanding of culture. So today we're going to look at the idea of culture and the definition, and we're going to look at different components of culture and how this impacts us. I've asked my classes for years if you could put any items into a time capsule, bury this in the ground. This would be, in a sense, a representation of your material culture. So what would you put in that time capsule? A lot of my students say a cell phone. That's the first answer usually. So I have to be more specific. What apps would you put on the cell phone? What apps or what streaming services best define your culture? What clothing items best define your culture? And these are what we would call material culture. Non-material culture would be the ideals, the ideas, the ideals, the values that best represent your culture. So here's the definition you'll see on a test: the language, beliefs, values, norms, and behaviors passed from one generation to the next. And that leads me to the next question, which is, how do we pass culture on? You could say that culture is taught, but most importantly, culture is caught. Over the years, my students have told me stories as I've asked them in class about memorable moments with their grandfathers or their grandmothers or their moms and dads when they just picked up culture. Now, typically, the component of culture that's easiest to change is the material. If you take out your phone and look at it right now, it will basically be obsolete in a year or two. You'll probably have a new phone, if not sooner. Maybe you're like me and you stick around, you hold on to phones for a while, but the idea here is that technology changes. Ideas are slower to change. And when you see that the ideas and the values of a culture or subculture lag behind, this is culture lag. So as we look at the coronavirus that has taken place, one thing that I'm telling a lot of folks is that this is, in a sense, punting us out of our comfort zone. And what you're finding is that a lot of times people have had culture lag. Maybe you see teachers here that are hesitant to teach an online class. Well, now you don't have much of a choice. Perhaps you haven't, if you have parents or grandparents that haven't really used a lot of technology, this era of unprecedented change is causing us really to make some changes. So life happens, and life has a way of pushing us outside of our cultural lag and our comfort zones. So if we ask the question, what is normal? What is natural? This brings up to us an idea of sociological importance. I want you to think about a time when you experienced culture shock. So I often ask my students, tell me about a time when you had culture shock. And I always ask students to tell me about a time if they've gone out of the country. And usually in every class, I have students that have gone to foreign countries. And that's usually the best opportunity to really look at culture shock. This is when we come into contact with a culture that is so different. And I've known people who actually get homesick. What I mean by homesickness is there's some people, when you're in a environment that's totally different than what you're used to, it can rock you to the core. I've known people who've gone to foreign countries that are so different, and they get depressed. Maybe they can't find food that they're accustomed to, and they just, or maybe the country that you're in is doesn't practice some of the same cleanliness. America is very clean culture, and here again we're becoming twice as clean because of coronavirus. But when you go to cultures that don't have the same social space norms, again, this is obsolete because everybody's keeping 6 feet apart. But this is interesting to talk about because a lot of us have culture shock in this coronavirus era. Because if you go into public and everybody's staying 6 feet, we in America typically are comfortable with 3 or 4 feet distance. So I think a lot of you are probably experiencing culture shock, and I'll be interested to hear what you have to say in our discussion board if that is the case. But if you've gone out of the country, or you know someone who has, or even if you've gone to a different part within our culture, let me know, and let's talk about this in a discussion board. I'll be interested to hear what you have to say. This has been my favorite lecture over the years, or one of them, because I just love hearing stories from students. I had a student one time who had served in the military and was serving a post in a culture that did not use toilet paper. They actually, she recounted, would take a water bottle and pour it behind their back and would clean up after themselves after using the restroom with their hands. This is not uncommon in some cultures. They oftentimes will not use their left hand in this culture because they see that as impolite. So if you were to experience that, I guarantee you would have culture shock. Usually it's a good idea to get debriefed or to get prepared when you're going into another culture. So then that leads us to this idea of ethnocentrism. It's the belief that our culture is the best. It's certainly what we're used to. And Richard Edgerton speaks to this when he talks about sick cultures, because it leads to the question, is there ever a time when we do not practice cultural relativism? Sociologists do. Sociologists take a culture on its own terms. So the question is not, is this thing inherently wrong? Sociologists typically try to table that question and ask, well, what does this practice mean to this community? Richard Edgerton did say, however, there are some cultures that are sick, that there are some cultural universals, cultures, for instance, that turn a blind eye to sex trafficking and the like. When we look at cultures, we need to look at the symbolic components. So 5 of them: symbols, gestures, language, norms, and values. You could say that symbols, I oftentimes tell my students, I ask them, has the symbol of marriage changed? Immediately, all students say yes. So marriage means something different to this generation than it did to your great-grandparents' generation. For them, marriage was oftentimes a have to, and for you, it's a want to. We simply think that we'll get married when we log into a dating site such as eHarmony and find the person whose profile we find most striking. And I say that tongue-in-cheek with a little bit of humor. But you're probably thinking that marriage will follow romantic love, because most marriages in America, we see that as a value. However, romantic love was de-emphasized and pragmatics was elevated. So you got married 60 or 70 years ago in this country. You got married because you had to, because not just it was socially acceptable, but you got married because you're probably living in an agricultural society. You needed children to help run the farm. So symbols change, but think of symbols as concepts. And it's very interesting to study. Gestures. You might say that gestures are not universal, but gesturing is. So we have a very offensive hand gesture in our society. You guys know what that is. the middle finger. If you use this in certain societies, they will not be aware of it. Once they find out that you're insulting them, they will give you their own. Different societies have their own version of hello and bye and offensive hand gestures. So the point is, gestures are not universal, but gesturing is. Same goes for language. We're going to talk about language in a little greater detail, so I will table that, as well as norms and values. We'll speak to these in just a second. So 5 purposes of language. A language allows us to share cumulative experience. What that means is, when you study the way primates communicate, so Jane Goodall studied primates in Africa, and she found that there is, in a sense, some use of tools. She found that these banana leaves are used to eat ants. However, you would have a dad, a father, kind of the king of the tribe, primates, and he's eating all these ants, but his son's right next to him, and his son is not picking up on this knowledge, he's not sharing the knowledge that he has, right? So it's kind of everyone just sort of finds out, and humans are not that way, because humans can use language. You use language through your social media accounts, right? When you say, hey, had a great time on vacation, we. So if you're taking notes, you just write the word, quote, we, because language allows you to communicate a cumulative experience, we, together. You could talk about a shared past. So my family did blank during the quarantine. Or my family hopes to blank next year on vacation, right? You have a shared future. You could have a shared political perspective. It's political season, and this is obviously, the 2 things you don't talk about in public, politics and religion. You're talking about online, your social media accounts. You can insult people on your social media accounts and get into Twitter arguments, but you can't talk about religion and politics in a work environment. But of course, in sociology, we talk about them both. And language allows, for instance, if you have political views that are different than your family's, you could join a political group, and the language allows you to have shared perspectives. And it also enables us to knock out tasks, right? To accomplish complex goal-directed behavior. When we talk about language, you have to think about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So instead of objects determining our language, language determines the way we see objects according to this hypothesis. So you had Sapir and Whorf. These are 2 anthropologists who were studying Native Americans, and they hypothesized, after studying this tribe, that whereas they had dozens of words for cloud formations, they did not have words for past and future. They were living in the moment. Another example of this is the Greeks had 3 words for love, right? Americans have 1 word for love, right? We love cheeseburgers, we love baseball, we love our moms and dads, but that word can't mean all of those things. One of my favorite assignments in class historically has been to go to the whiteboard and ask my students to come up with words that haven't existed before, or words that did exist but they mean something differently. So for instance, tweet, right? Tweet is a word that has existed for centuries, decades, but the word tweet means something different now. Okay, so also you could think of another way to do the assignment is, or the task in class when I have this discussion, is to give me as many words as you can think of for technology. All right, my class is filled up, my whiteboard, with words that describe technology and new words that didn't exist. However, if I were to say, wipe the board clean and say, okay, now give me as many words as you can for planting a harvest, right? Farm-related words. The only people that could answer that are folks whose families have a farm, right? Most of us, because we're not an agricultural society, are removed from that. So the point of this is the words that populate our vocabulary come from how we see the world. If you were born in a different culture, you'd speak a different language, and the language that you were assigned would impact the way you view the world. It just would, because our language carries with it ways of viewing the world, according to Sapir-Whorf. Another symbolic component of culture, norms and sanctions, and this is huge, very frequently, often discussed in sociology. Norms are the expectations or rules for behavior, informal and formal norms. Norms will change as culture change. And then sanctions are the reaction to either following or breaking the norms. So y'all just, every single day in this coronavirus era, I go out in public and I think about sociology. Because if you go into a restaurant now, we have a mask mandate out in public, you're now negatively sanctioned if you don't wear a mask, right? In some cultures, you will be negatively sanctioned if you do wear a mask. So even here in the South, you have some people who think if you wear a mask, then you're a hyper-liberal Democrat, and others think, you know, if you're not wearing a mask, you're uneducated, unscientific, conservative, and and so it's very bizarre. And what's happening is you're having a clash of cultures. And so what you're seeing now is that everyone is violating the norms that we're used to if you're wearing a mask. You just are. We didn't do that. I can remember when in China they had the SARS outbreak, and you would see the news and they were all wearing masks, and you just think, wow, hey, I'm glad that's not happening here, but now it's happening here, right? So I think this is giving us more empathy, realizing that next time we see something like a global pandemic, we're going to have a lot more empathy. And hopefully this class and the events of COVID-19 will cause us to be more empathetic to those around us. Okay, so also another activity that I love doing in class is I like to ask students to tell me, we like talking about informal norms. This is actually one of my favorite things to talk about, because informal norms, I think, are sometimes more important. So like if I use the ID rule in an on-ground class here at Colin, we've had the norm. It's a formal norm, meaning it's policy that we wear our ID. And whatever policy is written in a student handbook, there's a formal norm. Another formal norm is a speed limit. But informal norms are those norms which sometimes can be more important to us. So for instance, the fashion rules that your friends have. So your friends will probably make fun of you if you break an informal norm. Nowadays, whatever social media site is yours, so it could be Twitter or Snapchat, Instagram, now Facebook for old folks like me. But the idea here is, what kind of things would you be made fun of by your friends if you did online? So for instance, if you're, you would get negatively sanctioned if you like a photo that is buried in someone's timeline, right? Negatively sanctioned, right? You're creeping, or you're, that's creepy for you to do that. And I've just had a blast teaching this class, finding out from my students, what kind of things would you be made fun of by your friends? In my day, it's to show you how norms change over time. In my day, it was wearing socks with sandals. You would have gotten blasted. Now I see people wearing socks with sandals all the time. Growing up as a kid, if you wanted to wear boots and be country, right? Possibly you could and not get made fun of if you have friends that like that music. But if you wore boots and shorts, you'd get destroyed. You just weren't going to do that. The first semester I ever started teaching at Colan, it was on a rainy day. Girls were wearing rain boots and shorts. It was like a thing. I can remember in my mind a red flag going off like, hey, this girl's going to get made fun of, but people didn't. So it's interesting. You see times change, and whatever was the norm when you were in high school, 20 years from now, you'll be like, what's going on with the world? But norms change. 3 types of norms: folkways, social mores, and taboos. So folkways are norms that are not strictly enforced. So, for instance, a guy who takes off his shirts walking across campus may or may not be enforced. A social more, however, if females were to take off their shirts, they would be violating our social more, which is nudity, all right, where we put clothes on. And so when these norms are broken, they go against society's basic core values. In my lifetime, I've seen these change. I really have. Taboos are things when are broken are considered repulsive. In my lifetime, I've seen taboos become folkways. And I have seen folkways really become taboos. I really have. You live long enough, you're going to see these things change. Cultures break into smaller groups. And a culture within a dominant culture is a subculture. So whatever extracurricular activity you were a part of in high school, whether it was playing a sport or in the band or in dance team or chess club, that's a world within a larger world. You have shared activities and language and shared words. A counterculture is also a group within a larger group. However, the norms and values clash with those of the dominant culture. So I watched a documentary on the use of social media among gangs. So in the inner city Chicago, this was, I guess, about several years ago, but law enforcement actually began investigating crime and kind of anticipating when a gang would retaliate by watching their Facebook pages. And so here you have a counterculture, which is gang activity, and really broadcasting their intended acts of violence and even celebrating, or when they were successful in this. And so when the norms and values clash with a dominant culture, it's a counterculture, such as gangs, criminal activities. And sociologists could study this. And what's interesting is that the law enforcement reached out to a sociologist to teach them, a sociologist who really specialized in gang communication. Nowadays, sociologists are doing their research by going on Facebook, just like everything else. So you actually could study gang activity as a sociologist by going online. Here we have values in society. The sociologist Robin Williams came up with these 15 values. Now, you will see some of these that really go hand in hand, and you'll see some that really contradict one another. So a value cluster would be when values go together, such as education and activity and work, and individualism, which is we value you choosing your own mate, your own educational degree plan, etc. But we also see value contradictions. So we have valued equality. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. But we also see racism and group superiority, that our founding fathers who voiced desire for freedom also owned slaves. So we see these kind of things coexisting or contradicting, value clusters and value contradictions. And even through this lecture, I want to encourage you, if you want to take a screenshot or pause it, take screenshots, embed them in your own notes, take notes as we're going along. Some emerging values: leisure, self-fulfillment, physical fitness, youthfulness, and concern for the environment. So that leads us to a question. Sociologists talk about real culture and the ideal culture. So ideal culture is who a culture wants to be. The real culture is who the culture actually is. And oftentimes, the norms and values that we actually follow are real culture. So sometimes the reason why we have a value contradiction is because what we say we want and what we say we like, we don't actually do. That's interesting to talk about, because as a sociologist, we should be able to check our own values at the door and also check our ideal culture or our culture's ideal and put that aside and actually say, this is what sociology actually values. Technology in a global village. Technology is central to a group's material culture. And that's why at the beginning of the lecture, I just asked you to think about, if you were putting a phone in a time capsule, right, what would be the app or the apps you would download that best represent who your culture is? And a new technology refers to the emerging technology that has significance on impact in social life. For me, I think the new technology in my era, or the best new bit of material culture is a mask. So for instance, if we're just looking at the role of what a mask is, to me, if you're putting a time capsule today, you don't bury that thing without putting a mask. Whether you think people who wear masks are hyper-liberal, or if you think people who wear masks are responsible. So right now, even a mask is a political divide. So I'm thankful that here at Colin, right now, folks are really being faithful to wear their masks, students and teachers alike, and following the rules. So I look forward to finding out what you think about what new technology it really typifies. It could be a self-driving car. It could be Amazon delivering food to your doorstep through a drone, right? All these things are happening. So the question then comes, cultural diffusion. This is the spreading of culture from one to another. So cultural diffusion is the process, but cultural leveling is the result. So when cultures start to become very similar to one another, they have been leveled. And there's great cultural leveling now because of technology, transportation, and we live in a global village. So I look forward to finding out what you think about this lecture, and look forward really to hear what you have to say about it. All right, y'all take care, be safe.